On June 19, 1944, Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe strapped into the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M-0 fighter on the deck of the carrier Shikoku. The morning sun glinted off the Philippine Sea as he advanced his throttle, ready to lead 48 aircraft against the American fleet somewhere over the horizon. He had no idea that 60 miles away, American radar operators had been watching his strike package since before it left the deck. They knew his altitude, his heading, even his exact distance. And right now, 50 American fighters were being vectored directly toward his formation by controllers, sitting in air-conditioned rooms below the carrier decks, tracking every move he made on glowing green screens. Zenji Abe didn't believe in radar. Most Japanese pilots didn't. They'd been told it was primitive, unreliable, little more than American propaganda. Real aerial combat, they'd learned, depended on sharp eyes, superior training, and the samurai spirit. Technology was no match for human skill. In the next 11 minutes, Abe would discover how catastrophically wrong that assumption was. His strike force would be intercepted before they ever saw an American ship. Within an hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy would lose over 300 aircraft in what American pilots would mockingly call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But this story isn't really about one battle. It's about a technological chasm so vast that one side was fighting a war from the future, while the other clung desperately to the past. It's about the invisible weapon that transformed, aerial warfare forever, and the stubborn refusal to believe in something you couldn't see that cost Japan the Pacific War to understand. How Japanese pilots could fly into battle completely blind to the technology tracking their every move. We need to go back to where it all began, to the laboratories and boardrooms where the radar revolution was born, and the tragic miscalculations that left Japan for years behind before the war even started. In February 1935, British scientist Robert Watson Watt demonstrated something that seemed like science fiction. He bounced radio waves off a bomber, flying 10 miles away, and tracked its position on a cathode ray tube. The age of radar had begun by 1940. Britain's chain-home radar network was detecting Luftwaffe bombers 80 miles away, giving Fighter Command precious minutes to scramble Spitfires and Hurricanes. This invisible shield helped save Britain during the darkest days of the Blitz. Across the Atlantic, American scientists watched with fascination. The U.S. Navy's research lab developed the CXAM radar, a massive system that could detect aircraft up to 70 miles away. It was crude, temperamental, and revolutionary. Then came the breakthrough that changed everything, the cavity magnetron in 1940. British physicists John Randall and Harry Boot created a device no larger than a coffee can that could generate powerful microwave radiation. This copper cylinder, with 8 precisely machined cavities, could produce radar waves 1,000 times, more powerful than previous systems, with resolution so fine it could distinguish individual aircraft in a formation. It was arguably the most important invention of the war. The British shared this technology with America in an unprecedented act of scientific cooperation. By 1942, MIT's radiation laboratory was producing revolutionary microwave radars that could see through darkness, clouds, and storms. The SG surface search radar could spot a periscope at 6 miles. The SCR-584 could track artillery shells in flight. The technology was advancing so fast that new models were obsolete within months. The Americans and British weren't just developing radar, they were building an entire ecosystem around it. Fighter direction officers trained at special schools, learning to vector fighters onto targets they couldn't see. Communications networks linked radar stations to command centers. Doctrine evolved for controlled interception, turning radar data into coordinated aerial ambushes. The technology was revolutionary, but the system supporting it was equally critical. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, Japan was following a radically different path. Japanese engineers had actually developed radar independently in the late 1930s. Their sets worked. Some were quite sophisticated, but the Imperial Japanese Navy's leadership looked at these bulky, expensive systems and made a calculated decision. Radar wasn't worth the investment. Japan's naval aviators were the best in the world, elite pilots flying superior aircraft like the legendary Zero. Japanese optical technology produced the finest binoculars and rangefinders on the planet. Night optics gave their surface ships a deadly advantage in darkness. Why spend precious resources on unproven electronic systems when human skill had never failed them? This wasn't ignorance, it was a philosophy. The Japanese military culture prized individual mastery, intensive training, and warrior spirit. Technology that removed the human element seemed almost dishonorable. The Americans were building a system where ordinary pilots could become deadly through superior information. The Japanese were perfecting an approach where exceptional pilots became unstoppable through superior skill. Did you know that when Japan captured Singapore in February 1942, their engineers examined British and American radar equipment left behind? A team led by engineer Yoji Ito methodically dismantled an SCR-268 radar set. What they discovered should have terrified Japanese command. The Allies were 48 months ahead in radar technology. For years, an entire generation of technological evolution. The report went up the chain. It reached the Naval General Staff, and then nothing changed. Why? Because by mid-1942, Japan had conquered half the Pacific with tactics that worked brilliantly. Their carriers had struck Pearl Harbor without detection. Their pilots had sunk the Prince of Wales and Repulse. Their night-fighting surface ships had humiliated the US Navy at Savo Island. Success had validated their approach. Why abandon winning tactics for unproven technology? But across the Pacific, American carriers were installing ever more sophisticated radar systems. The new SK air search radar could detect aircraft at 100 miles. The SM height-finding radar could determine altitude with precision. Most critically, each carrier now had a combat information center, a dedicated room where fighter direction officers sat in front of radar repeater scopes, coordinating defensive fighters like chess masters moving pieces across a board. The Americans were building what modern military theorists call a system of systems, where individual technologies combined into something far more powerful than the sum of their parts. Radar detected threats. Radio communicated them. Fighter direction officers analyzed them. Vectoring instructions guided interceptors to perfect firing positions. The F-6F Hellcat wasn't just a fighter, it was a weapons platform guided by an invisible infrastructure. The Japanese, meanwhile, remained committed to their philosophy of individual excellence. Their new pilots received minimal training compared to the veterans of Pearl Harbor and the Indian Ocean. Why? Because radar couldn't make up for poor piloting, could it? Fuel was scarce. Training aircraft were needed for combat. And besides, the spirit of Bushido couldn't be taught in a classroom. The two sides were preparing for fundamentally different wars. And by June 1944, The consequences of that divergence were about to become catastrophic. The pivotal moment came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Though few realized its significance at the time, when Japanese strike aircraft approached Midway Island on June 4th, radar operators at stations across the atoll detected them 93 miles out, at 11,000 feet. Every American fighter on Midway had time to take off. Every bomber scrambled. The Japanese achieved surprise in their first attack, but it wasn't because of stealth, it was despite radar detection. The American carriers had CXAM radar. They detected Japanese scout planes. They picked up incoming strikes with enough warning to launch fighters. But here's what made the difference. Coordination was still primitive. Fighter direction officers were learning on the job. Communications were chaotic. The technology existed, but the system was immature. The Japanese sank Yorktown, but they lost for carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hairyu. American dive bombers caught them at their most vulnerable moment, flight decks crowded with armed aircraft being rearmed. Japanese carriers had no radar, no advanced warning. They depended entirely on visual lookouts, who spotted the Americans only when it was too late. After Midway, the Americans learned hard. Every carrier battle taught new lessons about radar employment, fighter direction, and coordinated defense. The Japanese learned too, but their lessons reinforced existing doctrine. They concluded they needed better pilots, more aggressive tactics, and superior numerical concentration. Technology remained secondary. By 1943, the gap was widening dramatically. American factory workers were installing the new SC radar on every major combatant. Destroyer escorts, the smallest ocean-going warships, carried radar that would have been cutting-edge on a battleship 2 years earlier. The technology was becoming democratized, spreading throughout the fleet. The Japanese Navy, meanwhile, finally began installing radar on major ships in late 1943. The Type 21 air search radar could detect aircraft at perhaps 60 miles under ideal conditions. It was a capable system, but Japan was producing them in hundreds, while America was producing radars in thousands. And Japanese doctrines still didn't emphasize radar-guided interception. The sets were there to provide warning. Actual fighter control remained visual. Then came the revolution in fighter direction. Lieutenant Commander David McCullough, fighter director on USS Essex, pioneered new techniques during the Gilbert Islands campaign. He didn't just vector fighters to intercept. He positioned them for altitude advantage. He coordinated multiple divisions to attack from different angles. He used radar data to predict enemy intentions and pre-position defenders. Fighter direction was evolving from simple guidance into sectorial orchestration. American pilots noticed the difference immediately. Lieutenant Alexander Vrotu later recalled, "We'd be sitting in ready rooms, playing cards, when the call would come. Pilots, man your planes. Bogies inbound, bearing 270, 60 miles. We'd launch. The fighter director would vector us directly onto them, and we'd hit them before they knew we were there. It was like shooting ducks in a barrel." The Japanese experienced it from the other side. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ito, who survived the war, described the confusion. "We would be flying toward the American fleet when suddenly fighters would appear from nowhere, always from our blind spot, always with altitude advantage. We were told to maintain formation. But how do you maintain formation when the enemy knows exactly where you are, and you have no idea where they are?" Did you know that by early 1944, American carriers were using a layered defense concept that was only possible because of radar. The combat air patrol was stationed in tiers, some fighters high and distant, others low and close. When radar detected an incoming raid, the fighter direction officer would vector the outer layer for the first interception. If any attackers broke through, inner layers would be vectored based on constantly updated radar tracks. It was defensive warfare as applied mathematics. But what truly amplified American superiority was the integration of a completely new technology, the VHF radio. Earlier in the war, fighter pilots had communicated on high-frequency radio that was unreliable and easily jammed. By 1944, every American fighter had VHF very high-frequency radios that were crystal clear and had enough channels that fighter direction officers could communicate with individual pilots without everyone else hearing. This meant vectoring instructions could be precise and continuous. Japanese fighters, meanwhile, still used primitive radio sets that barely worked. Many pilots simply turned them off to save weight and improve performance. The idea of a controller on a ship directing a fighter pilot to an invisible target seemed almost absurd to the Japanese warrior culture. A pilot should see his enemy close to gun range and prove his skill. Anything else was dishonorable. This philosophical gap was about to collide with technological reality. In the most one-sided battle in naval aviation history, in spring 1944, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa conceived Operation Ago, Japan's plan to destroy the American fleet in one decisive battle. He had 9 carriers with 450 aircraft. His plan relied on Japanese advantages, longer-range aircraft that could strike from beyond American reach, and land-based aircraft from the Marianas that would attack in coordination with carrier strikes. The Americans would be crushed between 2 overwhelming aerial attacks. Ozawa knew about American radar. His intelligence reports mentioned it, but he fundamentally misunderstood its implications. He thought radar was just better lookouts and incremental improvement. He didn't grasp that it had created an entirely new form of warfare. Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell commanded the American Carrier Task Force. He had 15 carriers with over 900 aircraft, but numbers weren't his real advantage. Every carrier had the latest radar. Every fighter had VHF radio. Every combat information center had experienced fighter direction officers. And critically, Mitchell had learned from 2 years of battle experience exactly how to turn technological superiority into tactical dominance. The 2 fleets began maneuvering on June 18, 1944. Japanese search planes spotted the Americans. First, traditional advantage. Ozawa prepared his strikes for the morning of June 19th, confident his longer-range aircraft would devastate the enemy before American planes could respond. What Ozawa didn't know was that American submarines had been tracking his fleet for days. American codebreakers had decrypted his operations plan, and American radar would see his strikes launching from over 100 miles away. Here's where the story gets truly fascinating. At 10 a.m. on June 19th, radar operators on USS Lexington detected the first Japanese strike while it was still forming up over Ozawa's carriers. 150 miles away, they watched it organize. They counted aircraft 69 planes. They tracked its heading and speed, and they had 45 minutes before it would arrive. Fighter direction officers vectored 50 Hellcats to intercept. They positioned them at 25,000 feet, 25 miles ahead of the Japanese formation. The Hellcats climbed to altitude, checked their guns, and waited. The fighter directors talked them onto the target like air traffic controllers. Bandits at 12 o'clock level, 20 miles, 15 miles, 10 miles. Tally-ho! Lieutenant Commander C.W. Brewer was leading one Hellcat division. He later described the interception. We were positioned perfectly sun behind us. Altitude advantage, attacking from their blind spot. They never saw us until we were firing. We came down in a high-side run and just tore through their formation. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Of those 69 Japanese aircraft in the first strike, 42 were shot down before they ever saw an American ship. The rest were harried all the way to the fleet, arriving disorganized and demoralized. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed most of the remainder. One bomb hit the battleship South Dakota, causing minimal damage. That was it. 16-9 aircraft for one superficial hit. Abe was flying in the second strike 48 aircraft launched at 9 a.m. His formation was detected 110 miles out at 10:47. Hellcats were vectored to intercept. The Americans were waiting at 20,000 feet when the Japanese arrived at 14,000. Abe never had a chance to demonstrate the skills honed through years of training. He never got close enough to the American carriers to use his superior torpedo bombing technique. He was shot down at 11:39 a.m. by a Hellcat pilot he never saw, vectored onto his tail by a fighter direction officer he didn't know existed, tracked by radar technology he didn't believe in. By the end of June 19th, Japan had launched 4 major strikes, 326 aircraft total. American radar detected every single one while they were still distant. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcats, 2 perfect interception points for every raid. The Japanese lost over 300 aircraft. The Americans lost to 9. American pilots started calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But the tragedy went deeper than the numbers. In those 4 strikes were the last of Japan's experienced carrier pilots, veterans of Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean, and the Coral Sea. Men who had trained for 5 years were shot down in 5 minutes by Americans with 6 months of training. Why? Because the Americans had a system that made ordinary pilots extraordinarily effective, while the Japanese had a philosophy that made extraordinary pilots into ordinary casualties. The full horror of Japan's technological blindness became clear in the months following the Philippine Sea. On Saipan, American forces captured intact Japanese radar installations. Technical intelligence officers from the Naval Research Laboratory examined them with professional interest. The Type 22 surface search radar was actually quite sophisticated. The magnetron design showed genuine innovation. The Type 21 air search radar had clever features. These weren't primitive systems. Japanese engineers were clearly talented, but there were only a handful of them. Saipan, a critical base in Japan's inner defense perimeter, had perhaps 6 radar sets total. An equivalent American island base would have had 50. The difference wasn't in capability. It was in scale, integration, and doctrine. Captain John Poindexter, who led the technical intelligence assessment, later wrote, "The Japanese understood radar technology. What they didn't understand was that radar wasn't just technology, was the foundation of an entire tactical system. They saw it as a tool. We saw it as a revolution." This distinction became devastatingly clear during the battles for the Philippines in October 1944. By this point, Japan was desperately short on trained pilots. The naval air groups that attacked American carriers were filled with pilots who had perhaps 60 hours of flight time, barely enough to land safely. let alone engage in combat. But Japanese planners convinced themselves that superior numbers and kamikaze tactics could compensate for inferior training. They still didn't understand what they were up against. On October 24th, Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force was approaching through the San Bernardino Strait when American search planes detected it. The battle off Samar the next morning became a textbook demonstration of how radar-directed coordination could defeat superior firepower. Kurita had 4 battleships, including the massive Yamato with her 18-inch guns. He had 6 heavy cruisers. He stumbled upon a group of 6 American escort carriers, tiny ships with thin armor, small aircraft capacity, and no business fighting battleships. It should have been a slaughter, but those escort carriers had radar. They had fighter direction officers. And they had aircraft that could be vectored with precision based on constantly updated radar plots of Japanese ship positions. American planes attacked from multiple directions, simultaneously, not by accident, but because radar-equipped destroyers were tracking every Japanese ship and vectoring strikes to hit them from blind spots. Kurita had superior firepower, but inferior information. His ships fired visually, hitting targets they could see. The Americans fired based on radar data, hitting targets that were sometimes beyond visual range. Kurita's cruisers maneuvered to dodge air attacks they could see forming, but radar-directed attacks came from angles they didn't expect. At times, they couldn't predict. After 2 hours of this invisible coordination, Kurita broke off. He had overwhelming military superiority, but complete informational inferiority. He was fighting blind against an enemy who could see everything. The frustration broke him. Did you know that Japanese pilots attempting kamikaze attacks in late 1944 faced an even more insurmountable challenge? American destroyers were deployed as radar pickets, ships positioned 50 miles ahead of the main fleet specifically to detect incoming raids as early as possible. These destroyers carried the latest SK-2 radar that could detect aircraft at 120 miles. They had fighter direction officers who could coordinate combat air, patrol fighters to intercept kamikazes long before they reached the fleet. Ensign Yukio Saiki, who led the first organized kamikaze attack on October 25, 1944, faced this system. American radar detected his formation 70 miles out. Hellcats were vectored to intercept. Of the 5 aircraft in Saika's group, 3 were shot down before reaching the American carriers. Saiki and 1 wingman broke through a 40% success rate that was actually considered good under the circumstances. But here's what made the kamikaze challenge truly impossible. American radar could detect individual aircraft, which meant fighter direction officers could vector multiple fighters against single kamikazes. A kamikaze pilot flying alone faced 2 or 3 Hellcats guided precisely onto his tail. The mathematics were brutal. The electronics were unforgiving. The tragedy was that by this point late 1940, for many mid-level Japanese officers understood the radar gap. They'd seen captured equipment. They'd experienced radar-directed interceptions. They knew. But the institutional inertia of the Imperial Japanese military was too great to overcome. Admitting that American electronic technology had made traditional Japanese aerial supremacy obsolete would have required fundamentally questioning the entire basis of military culture. In November 1944, a fascinating document surfaced in Japanese naval communications. A group of surviving carrier pilots had drafted a report analyzing the Philippine Sea battle. They specifically mentioned American electrical detection equipment and its role in vectoring fighters to precise interception points. They recommended urgent development of equivalent systems and completely new tactics to account for American radar superiority. The report was classified, not because it contained secrets, but because it contained truths too uncomfortable to acknowledge. The pilots who wrote it were quietly reassigned. The report vanished into archives. The war continued as if radar didn't exist. American advances, meanwhile, accelerated. By early 1945, the new SX radar could detect aircraft at 200 miles. The SM-1 could determine altitude with such precision that fighter direction officers could vector Hellcats to specific attack headings, accounting for altitude differentials. The APQ-13 radar being installed on night fighters could detect individual aircraft at 10 miles and guide the fighter to visual range in total darkness. Japan had nothing equivalent. Not because Japanese scientists were incapable, they weren't, but because Japan had made a strategic choice in 1940 that human skill mattered more than electronic systems. And by 1945, that choice had become irreversible. The final crushing irony came during the battle for Okinawa in spring 1945. Japan launched Operation Kaikasui mass kamikaze attacks intended to overwhelm American defenses through sheer numbers. Thousands of aircraft, including trainers and obsolete types, were pressed into suicide missions. The plan was simple. So many planes would attack simultaneously that American fighters couldn't intercept them all. But radar changed the math. American Pickett destroyers detected each Kikasui wave while it was still assembling over Kyushu, 350 miles away. This gave fighter direction officers over an hour to position combat air patrol fighters in layered formations. The Americans could see Japanese aircraft massing. They could predict attack routes. They could pre-position defenders and rotate fighters to maintain constant coverage. The kamikaze pilots flew into a systematic aerial meat grinder. They were detected before they left Japanese airspace, tracked across hundreds of miles of ocean, intercepted by fighters positioned exactly where radar data suggested they would be most effective, and those who survived the fighter screen were engaged by radar-directed anti-aircraft fire, using proximity-fused shells that didn't need direct hits to destroy aircraft. Of the 1,900 kamikaze aircraft launched during Kaikasui operations, approximately 14% successfully hit ships, still devastating, but nowhere near the decisive impact Japan needed. The American radar system had turned a tidal wave of aerial suicide attacks into a mathematically calculable attrition problem. It was warfare reduced to statistics, made possible by technology that removed uncertainty. The war ended in August 1945, when American occupation forces examined Japanese radar research facilities. They found something unexpected. Japan had actually developed microwave radar independently. Their cavity magnetron design was different from the British version, but functionally equivalent. Japanese engineers had been working on advanced systems, including early warning radar networks and even primitive airborne intercept radar. The technology existed. The scientists were brilliant. So what went wrong? Admiral Matome Ugoki, who survived the war, explained it in his diary with brutal clarity. We never lacked the technology. We lacked the system. The Americans built radar into their entire way of fighting. We added radar to a fighting system that had already been perfected without it. They revolutionized warfare. We improved our equipment. This distinction mattered enormously. Japanese ships that carried radar used it like enhanced lookouts, helpful, but not fundamental. American ships used radar as the central nervous system of integrated defense. Japanese radar operators reported what they saw. American fighter direction officers commanded what happened. The human cost was staggering. Japan lost approximately 27,000 naval aviators during the Pacific War. Many were elite pilots whose training had taken 5 years irreplaceable human capital. They died not because they lacked skill or courage, but because they were fighting using tactics from 1940 against technology from 1944, the American approach building. Systems that made ordinary people extraordinarily effective, through superior technology and coordination, would define warfare for the next 80 years. The Israeli Air Force would use centralized radar control to devastating effect in 1967. The U.S. Navy's Aegis combat system would apply the same principles at dramatically larger scale. The modern concept of network-centric warfare is a direct descendant of those. Fighter direction officers sitting in front of radar scopes in 1944, orchestrating battles they couldn't directly see. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Abe's body was never recovered. He's listed among the pilots lost during the Philippine Sea Battle. His family in Hiroshima received a brief notification that he had died heroically in defense of the empire. They never learned that he'd been vectored into an ambush by technology he didn't believe existed. Shot down by a pilot guided by a controller using systems he'd never been trained to recognize. Warrant Officer Kiyoshi Ito, who survived, became a commercial pilot after the war. In 1978, he gave an interview to a Japanese aviation magazine. The interviewer asked what single factor had been most decisive in the Pacific Air War. Ito's answer was simple. The Americans could see us. We were blind. Everything else followed from that. Japan's radar gap had started with a reasonable decision in 1940. Invest in proven technologies and human excellence rather than experimental electronics. But warfare rewards those who adapt fastest to technological change. Britain and America built institutional structures that encouraged rapid innovation, information sharing, and tactical evolution. Japan's military culture prized stability, hierarchy, and proven methods. Both approaches had historical justification. But in the crucible of World War II, adaptability proved more valuable than tradition. Did you know that several Japanese naval officers argued for radar prioritization as early as 1941? Captain Chikao Yamamoto submitted a detailed report recommending immediate investment in radar development, fighter direction training, and integrated air defense systems. His report accurately predicted that the Americans would develop these capabilities and that Japan needed to match them or face catastrophic air losses. The report was filed as interesting but not urgent. Yamamoto was reassigned to a training command. He was killed in 1944 during an American air raid which Japanese radar detected too late to mount effective defense. The story of Japanese radar in World War II isn't really about technology. It's about how institutions respond to revolutionary change. Japan had brilliant engineers who understood electronics. They had tactical innovators who recognized radar's potential. What they lacked was an institutional structure that could rapidly incorporate revolutionary technology into doctrine, training, and operations. The Americans built that structure not because they were smarter, but because their military culture valued pragmatic effectiveness over traditional excellence. There's a broader lesson here about technological transitions. The side that wins isn't necessarily the one that invents the new technology. It's the one that figures out how to integrate it into an entirely new way of operating. Britain invented radar. America turned it into a system. Japan had the technology, but not the system, and in modern warfare, systems beat technologies. Think about Lieutenant Commander Abe climbing into his Zero on June 19th, 1944. He was a skilled pilot in a capable aircraft, carrying out a sound tactical plan. He did everything right according to the doctrine he'd been taught, and he died anyway, not because he failed, but because the entire conceptual framework of his training had become obsolete, and nobody had told him. That's the real tragedy. Not the technology gap itself, but the institutional blindness that prevented recognition of it. The American radar advantage was never secret. Japanese pilots reported it. Captured equipment revealed it. Analysis proved it. But the Imperial Japanese Navy's culture couldn't process information that contradicted its fundamental assumptions about warfare. When German pilots examined the captured P-51 Mustang and said, "We are fighting the future with machines," from the past, they were acknowledging a truth there. Leadership never fully accepted. Japanese pilots in 1944 could have said the same thing, not about their aircraft, which was still quite capable, but about their entire approach to aerial warfare. They were fighting with a philosophy from the past, against a system from the future. The invisible weapon that won the Pacific War wasn't radar. It was the willingness to believe in things you couldn't see, to reorganize around revolutionary technology, and to admit when old methods had become obsolete. The Americans possessed that willingness. The Japanese, tragically, did not. And that made all the difference.